Throughout history, humans have faced crises. Empires rose and fell. Money failed. Trust vanished. Often it was human error or sheer irrationality.
Every crime leaves traces, clues, patterns, connections. But some crimes are invisible. They leave numbers. Numbers that vanish, twist, betray. What you're seeing is the evidence of one of history's deadliest crimes. Not bullets, not knives. Money itself was the weapon. Follow the strings, examine the board. This is the story of hyperinflation.
In 1923, in the heart of Europe, the fundamental laws of reality stopped working. People stopped counting money, not because they were wealthy beyond measure, but because the numbers simply ceased to mean anything. Banknotes were no longer carried in wallets. They were hauled in suitcases. Salaries weren't paid in envelopes. They were transported in wheelbarrows. And children, innocent children, used stacks of official government currency as building blocks, or in the colder months, as fuel for the fire. This didn't happen because of a natural disaster. It wasn't the result of a foreign invasion or a plague or a technological collapse. It happened because one man, sitting in a quiet office in Berlin, believed that he could fix a broken nation with a printing press. This man conducted the most dangerous economic experiment in human history. He printed so much money that he didn't just bankrupt a country, he broke the psychological spine of a generation. The impossible debt. To understand how a sensible man destroys a nation, we have to look at the wreckage of 1918. Germany had lost the Great War. The Kaiser, Wilhelm II, had fled. The empire was dissolved. But the fighting had stopped only to be replaced by a different kind of warfare, financial warfare. The victors, Britain and especially France, wanted Germany to pay. They didn't just want reparations, they wanted revenge. So they wrote the Treaty of Versailles, an agreement signed after the war that officially ended the fighting and decided who would be punished and how. Under its terms, Germany was forced to accept blame for the war and handed a bill of 132 billion gold marks. To put that in perspective, the debt was nearly 3 times the total value of all property in Germany at the time. It was a debt that could not be paid. Germany had been stripped of its colonies. Its merchant fleet, the ships that carried German goods and earned foreign money, was confiscated. Its industrial regions were occupied. They had no gold. They had no foreign credit. All they had was a new, fragile democracy, the Weimar Republic. After the emperor fled in 1918, Germany's old monarchy collapsed overnight. The Weimar Republic was the government that replaced it, civilian leaders, elected in a hurry, trying to run a defeated nation. It was young, inexperienced, and deeply unpopular. Monarchists thought it was illegal. Veterans thought it was weak. And many ordinary Germans blamed it for the war itself, even though it had no part in starting it. On paper, it promised democracy, elections, a parliament, and civil rights. In reality, it barely survived month to month, threatened by protests, political violence, and constant economic chaos. And to keep the system running, to pay workers, fund the state, and meet impossible obligations, it relied on the one institution that still functioned quietly, efficiently, and legally: the central bank. The government was terrified. If they raised taxes to pay the debt, the people would revolt. If they refused to pay, the French army would invade. Caught between a revolution and an invasion, the politicians turned to the Reichsbank for a miracle. The man in the high collar. The man they turned to was Rudolf Havenstein. And this is where the tragedy begins. Because Havenstein wasn't a villain. He wasn't a corrupt thief stealing from the treasury. He was a bureaucrat. He was the president of the Reichsbank, a man with a high collar, a monocle, and a reputation for absolute integrity. He had run the bank through the war. He was a symbol of the old order. But Havenstein was blinded by a specific, fatal economic theory. It was called the Real Bills Doctrine. It sounds boring, but it's the deadliest idea in economic history. Havenstein believed that money was only inflationary if you printed it to fund speculation. He believed that if you printed money to pay for real work and real goods, it couldn't cause inflation. To him, money was just a receipt for value. So, if the government needed to pay a railway worker, Havenstein believed that printing the money for that salary was safe, because the railway worker provided a service. He didn't understand that if you print money faster than you produce goods, the money becomes worthless. He saw the German economy struggling for air, and he decided that the oxygen it needed was paper. The catalyst, the Ruhr. For a few years, the system wobbled, but it held. But in January 1923, the catastrophe began. Germany fell behind on its payments, specifically a delivery of telephone poles and coal. France lost patience. French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr Valley. The Ruhr was the industrial heart of Germany. It was where the coal was mined and the steel was forged. The French soldiers came to take the resources by force. The German government couldn't fight back militarily, as they had no army left, so they chose passive resistance. They told the workers, "Do not work. Do not mine the coal. Do not load the trains. Stay home." It was a general strike. But here was the problem. If millions of workers are on strike, how do they eat? The German government promised to pay their wages, even though they weren't working. They were paying millions of people to produce absolutely nothing. The supply of goods went to zero. The supply of money went to infinity. Rudolf Havenstein was given the order: print enough money to keep the Ruhr alive. The Delusion of Velocity. Havenstein approached the task with German efficiency. He didn't just rely on the state printing press. He subcontracted the work. He hired 130 private printing companies. 30 paper mills worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, just to supply the raw paper stock. At the Reichsbank, the scene was chaotic. Trucks were lined up outside, engines idling, waiting to be loaded with fresh bales of cash to drive across the country. And at first, it seemed to work. The strikers were paid. The lights stayed on. There was a brief, drunken sensation of prosperity. With so much cash floating around, people bought things. The stock market soared. Exporters made fortunes because the weak currency made German goods cheap abroad.
Exports, cheap abroad.
But this was an illusion. Inside the Reichsbank, Havenstein noticed something disturbing. Prices were rising. But he didn't blame the printing press. He blamed the exchange rate. He blamed the French. He blamed the lack of confidence. His solution: print more. He argued that the reason prices were high was that there wasn't enough money to pay for them. He was trying to put out a fire by pouring gasoline on it, convinced that it was water. The death of the mark. By the summer of 1923, the slide turned into a free fall. We call this hyperinflation. But that word is too clinical. It doesn't capture the madness. Hyperinflation is when the concept of price disappears. Let's look at the numbers. Before the war, 4.2 German marks bought you $1 US. By January 1923, it took 17,000 marks to buy $1. Bad, but manageable. By August, 1 million marks. By November, 4 trillion marks. A newspaper that cost 1 mark in 1914 cost 70 million marks in 1923. Life became a race against the clock. The velocity of money reached terminal speed. The moment you received a banknote, it was burning a hole in your hand. You had to spend it immediately. If you ordered a coffee for 5,000 marks, by the time the waiter brought the bill, it might be 8,000. Workers demanded to be paid twice a day. At lunchtime, factory whistles would blow, and workers would sprint to the gates where their wives were waiting. They would throw bundles of cash to them, and the wives would run to the nearest bakery or grocery store. If they tripped, if they stopped to tie a shoe, the price of bread might double. The social collapse. The economic damage was bad. The moral damage was worse. Society is built on trust. Money is just a physical token of that trust. When money dies, trust dies. The middle class was wiped out. Imagine you are a retiree. You worked for 40 years. You saved 50,000 marks, enough to live in luxury for the rest of your life. In 1923, that life savings wouldn't even buy you a postage stamp. Widows starved in apartments filled with fine furniture they couldn't eat. Teachers, judges, civil servants, the pillars of society, were reduced to beggars. Meanwhile, the sharks thrived. Those who had debt became kings. If you owed the bank 1 million marks for a mortgage, you could sell a single egg, walk into the bank, and pay off your entire house. Industrialists borrowed massive sums, bought up real estate and factories, and paid back the loans with worthless paper dust. The values of hard work and thrift were mocked. Why save? Why work? The only smart move was to gamble, to speculate, to cheat. Crime exploded. People looted fields for potatoes. They stole coal from trains. Prostitution spiked as desperate families sold anything to survive. Zero stroke. The psychological toll was documented by doctors. They called it zero stroke. It was a nervous condition caused by the need to calculate trillions. Shopkeepers had to calculate, if 1 egg is 40 billion, how much are 3 eggs and a liter of milk? People wandered the streets in a daze, staring at the zeros, unable to comprehend reality. Through it all, Rudolf Havenstein kept printing. He authorized notes of 50 trillion marks. He faced criticism from economists, but he remained stubborn. He actually issued a statement saying,
Die Reichsbank ist nicht schuld am Verfall der Mark.
The Reichsbank is not to blame for the depreciation of the mark. He truly believed that if he stopped printing, commerce would freeze. He couldn't see that the commerce had already died. He was just animating a corpse. The dark shadow. But the darkest consequence wasn't economic. It was political. When people lose everything, when they see that playing by the rules leads to starvation, they get angry. They look for someone to blame. They look for a savior. In Bavaria, a fringe radical group began to gain traction. They screamed that the government was made of traitors, that the banks were part of a global conspiracy. In November 1923, at the absolute peak of the inflation, when $1 was worth 4.2 trillion marks, the leader of this group made his move. He fired a pistol into the ceiling of a beer hall in Munich and declared a revolution. His name was Adolf Hitler. The beer hall putsch failed. Hitler was arrested, but the hyperinflation gave him his audience. It taught the German people a lesson that would haunt the world. Democracy cannot feed you. The system is rigged. The chaos of 1923 prepared the soil for the horrors that would come a decade later. The end of the madness. So, how did it stop? It didn't stop because Havenstein changed his mind. It stopped because he was sidelined. In late 1923, a new government appointed a currency commissioner named Hjalmar Schacht. Schacht understood what Havenstein didn't. It wasn't about paper, it was about psychology. They introduced a new currency, the Rentenmark. It wasn't backed by gold because they didn't have any. It was backed by a mortgage on all the land in Germany. Basically, they said, this money is worth something because Germany itself is worth something. But the crucial step was this. They stopped the printers. They told the government, if you can't pay your bills, too bad. No more printing. It was painful. Thousands of businesses went bankrupt instantly. Unemployment spiked, but the fever broke. People trusted the new money. Prices stabilized. The nightmare ended as quickly as it had begun. As for Rudolf Havenstein, history is full of strange coincidences. On November 20th, 1923, the very day the new Rentenmark was issued to save the country, Rudolf Havenstein suffered a massive heart attack and died. He died in his office, arguably a victim of the stress of his own creation. He went to his grave, believing he had done his duty. Germany recovered. The Roaring Twenties arrived in Berlin, but the scar tissue remained. To this day, the German central bank is the most inflation-phobic institution in the world because they remember. They remember the wheelbarrows. They remember the 50 trillion mark notes. And they remember how fragile civilization really is. It didn't take a war to destroy Germany. It just took a printing press and a man who didn't know when to turn it off.
Thank you for watching. This episode may be over, but history shows the lesson is rarely learned. Subscribe if you'd like to keep investigating. We'll see you at the next case.